The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, somewhere in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Martinez pressed his earpiece tighter, straining to hear through the interference. His SEAL team had been pinned down for 6 hours, their extraction point compromised, Taliban forces closing in from 3 sides. The darkness felt alive with hostile intent, muzzle flashes painting brief portraits of death across the rocky terrain. "Overlord, this is Neptune 6, Martinez whispered into his throat mic, his voice barely audible above the sporadic gunfire. "We need immediate air support. Grid coordinates follow." He rattled off numbers that meant everything and nothing, just another set of coordinates in an endless war, another desperate call for salvation that might never come. The operations center at Bagram Air Base received the transmission with the same mechanical efficiency they'd processed hundreds of others that month. Captain Rodriguez, the duty officer, studied the tactical display with tired eyes. The red dots representing friendly forces pulsed weakly on his screen, surrounded by estimated enemy positions marked in angry orange. Standard procedure called for an F-16 strike package, but the nearest fighters were engaged in operations 200 miles south. The clock on the wall seemed to mock them all, 0352 hours and counting. That's when Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez stepped into the frame, her flight suit bearing the weathered patches of someone who'd seen too many missions like this one. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from surviving what others couldn't. Her olive-green eyes held secrets that briefing rooms and after-action reports could never fully capture. The other pilots called her Ghost, for reasons they thought they understood, her ability to appear where enemies least expected, to vanish into terrain that should have been impossible to navigate. But tonight, the call sign would take on a meaning none of them had anticipated. "I'll take it," she said simply, her words cutting through the tension in the operations center like a blade through silk. Captain Rodriguez looked up, surprise flickering across his features. The A-10 Thunderbolt II wasn't typically called for close air support in mountainous terrain this challenging. The aircraft, affectionately known as the Warthog, was built for different kinds of warfare, slow, methodical, devastating. But Vasquez had made a career out of proving conventional wisdom wrong. The briefing was quick, efficient, brutal in its simplicity. 8 American lives hung in the balance. The weather was deteriorating. Time was running out. As Vasquez walked toward the flight line, her boots echoing against concrete still warm from the day's heat, she carried with her the weight of expectations that had followed her throughout a career spent proving that competence mattered more than assumptions, that skill transcended the narrow definitions others tried to impose upon her. The A-10 waited in the pre-dawn darkness like a sleeping predator. Its twin engines would soon roar to life, carrying with them a story that would ripple through military circles for years to come. But first, there was the mission. First, there were 8 lives to save. The rest would have to wait for dawn and the legend that was about to be born. In the mountains, Martinez checked his watch again and whispered another prayer to a god who seemed to have forgotten about small units of American soldiers fighting impossible odds in forgotten corners of the world. He had no way of knowing that salvation was already taxiing toward the runway, guided by hands that had never failed when it mattered most. The engines of the A-10 Thunderbolt II spun up with a distinctive whine that cut through the pre-dawn stillness of Bagram Air Base. Lieutenant Colonel Elena Vasquez ran through her final systems checks with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed this ritual hundreds of times before. Hydraulics nominal. Weapons systems armed. Navigation locked onto coordinates that represented more than just numbers on a grid. They represented Americans who would die if she failed. The control tower's voice crackled through her headset with professional detachment. "Ghost, you're cleared for immediate departure, runway 27. Weather update shows deteriorating conditions over target area. Visibility dropping to near zero in the valleys." "Copy tower, Ghost rolling." Her response carried none of the bravado that characterized younger pilots. At 34, Elena had learned that real confidence spoke in whispers, not shouts. The A-10 began its roll down the runway, gathering speed with the deliberate power that had earned the aircraft its fearsome reputation. Unlike the sleek fighters that dominated modern air forces, the Warthog was built around its gun, a 7-barrel GAU-8 Avenger cannon that could fire 70 rounds per second of 30 depleted uranium projectiles, capable of destroying main battle tanks. But tonight, precision mattered more than firepower. 8 American lives hung in the balance, pinned down in terrain that had swallowed armies throughout history. The mountains of eastern Afghanistan had a way of humbling even the most sophisticated military technology, reducing modern warfare to its most primitive elements: survival, marksmanship, and the thin line between life and death that separated victory from catastrophe. As the A-10 climbed into the star-filled darkness, Alina's mind wandered to the phone call she'd received 3 months earlier. Her father's voice, aged beyond his 67 years, telling her about the diagnosis: pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors gave him 6 months, maybe 8 if he responded well to treatment. She'd requested emergency leave twice, both times denied due to operational requirements. The war machine didn't pause for personal tragedy, even for pilots who had given their entire adult lives to service. "Ghost, this is Overlord," came the voice from the operations center. "Neptune 6 reports increasing enemy activity. Small arms fire from multiple directions. Time is critical." "Ghost copies. Estimate 12 minutes to target area." Alina's response was steady, professional, betraying nothing of the emotional weight she carried. The A-10 flew through darkness absolute, its navigation systems painting electronic pictures of terrain below that looked like the surface of an alien world. Jagged peaks thrust upward like broken teeth, valleys carved by centuries of wind and water creating a maze that had confounded invaders since Alexander the Great. The aircraft systems hummed with electronic efficiency, but Alina flew by instinct as much as instruments. Growing up in New Mexico, she'd learned to read the land from her grandmother, a woman who could predict weather changes by the way shadows fell across mesas, who understood that survival often depended on seeing what others missed. Those lessons, learned in childhood, had served her well in a career spent flying into situations where textbook tactics meant death. The radio crackled again, this time with Martinez's voice, strained with exhaustion and desperation. Any station, this is Neptune 6. We're taking heavy fire from elevated positions. Estimate company strength enemy force. Request immediate air support." The words carried weight beyond their tactical meaning. 8 Americans were about to die unless someone intervened, and Alina Vasquez was the only hope flying through the darkness toward them. The mountains loomed ahead like sleeping giants, their peaks disappearing into low clouds that promised to complicate everything. But Alina had spent 12 years turning impossible missions into footnotes in classified reports, and tonight would be no different. The A-10 descended through cloud cover thick as cotton, its pilot relying on instruments that painted ghostly green pictures of terrain below. Alina Vasquez had flown through worse weather, but never with stakes this personal. The voice of Staff Sergeant Martinez echoed in her headset, growing more desperate with each transmission. His team had been pinned down for 7 hours now, ammunition running low, wounded men growing weaker by the minute. "Neptune 6, this is Ghost," Alina transmitted, her voice cutting through static with calm authority. "I'm 3 minutes out from your position. Need you to mark your location with infrared strobes and give me a detailed breakdown of enemy positions." The relief in Martinez's voice was palpable. "Ghost, thank God. We've got approximately 30 to 40 Taliban fighters positioned in a horseshoe formation around our position. Primary threats are 2 machine gun nests on the ridgeline to our north, and what sounds like mortars being set up to our east. We're in a small depression about 50 meters south of a dead tree that should be visible on thermal imaging." Alina studied her multifunction displays, switching between infrared and low-light television feeds. The terrain below looked like a moonscape, all sharp angles and deep shadows. Finding 8 Americans in this maze would be challenging enough without enemy fire. The A-10's targeting systems were sophisticated, but they were only as good as the pilot interpreting the data, and interpretation required understanding the subtle signs that separated friendly forces from hostile contacts. "Ghost, be advised," came another voice from the operations center. "Weather is deteriorating rapidly in your area. Ceiling dropping below minimums for close air support. Recommend you abort and return to base." Alina's jaw tightened. Somewhere below, 8 Americans were making their peace with God, checking ammunition counts that wouldn't last another hour. Whether minimums were written by people who'd never had to explain to families why their sons and daughters died waiting for help that never came. She'd been flying in conditions worse than this since she was 22 years old, and she wasn't about to let bureaucratic caution cost American lives. "Overlord Ghost, I have good visibility on target area. Continuing approach." The lie came easily, born from years of making impossible missions possible. Visibility was near zero, but Alina had something better than perfect weather. She had intuition honed by thousands of hours flying over terrain that wanted to kill her, and a grandmother's voice whispering in her memory about reading signs that couldn't be measured by instruments. The A-10 dropped lower, its twin engines throttled back to near idle as Alina searched the darkness below. The aircraft's cannon was loaded with a mixed belt of armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds, each projectile capable of devastating accuracy when properly employed. But accuracy meant nothing without targets, and targets meant separating friend from foe in conditions that reduced the world to shadows and thermal signatures. Neptune 6 Ghost, I need continuous updates on enemy movement. Talk to me like I'm your eyes in the sky, because right now, that's exactly what I am. Alina's voice carried the confidence of someone who had never failed when American lives depended on her skills. Below, Martinez pressed his back against cold stone and began painting word pictures of a battlefield where death waited behind every rock and tree. The legend of Ghost was about to be written in gunfire and precision. But first, Alina had to find her targets in a darkness that seemed determined to hide them forever. Martinez's voice came through the static like a lifeline thrown to drowning men. "Ghost, I've got movement on the North Ridge. Muzzle flashes from approximately grid 789452. Two positions, maybe 300 meters apart." His words were clipped, professional despite the exhaustion that weighted every syllable. Around him, 7 other Americans pressed themselves against whatever cover they could find, their faith now resting entirely in the hands of a pilot they'd never met, flying an aircraft they couldn't see. Alina banked the A-10 into a wide left turn, her eyes alternating between the heads-up display and the multifunction screens showing thermal imagery of the terrain below. The Taliban positions Martinez described appeared as heat signatures against the cooler background of stone and vegetation. Two distinct sources of warmth, separated by exactly the distance he'd specified. Professional soldiers, well-positioned, probably with experience fighting American forces in terrain that gave them every advantage. Neptune 6, Ghost has visual on North Ridge positions. Stand by for gun run. Alina's finger moved to the trigger for the GAU-A cannon, a weapon that could fire 70-30 rounds per second with accuracy measured in millimeters rather than meters. But close air support wasn't about maximum firepower. It was about surgical precision, about eliminating threats without eliminating the Americans who desperately needed help. The A-10 descended through layers of mist that clung to the mountains like smoke, its pilot's eyes processing information faster than conscious thought could follow. Altitude, airspeed, target bearing, friendly positions, all variables in an equation that would be solved with bullets traveling at nearly half the speed of sound. Alina had performed calculations like these so many times they'd become instinct, muscle memory encoded in hands that knew exactly how much pressure to apply to controls that responded to touch measured in ounces. Guns, guns, guns. Alina announced over the radio, a warning that preceded the distinctive sound of the GAU-A opening fire. The cannon's roar was unlike anything else in military aviation, a buzzing growl that lasted exactly 2 seconds and sent 60 rounds of 30 ammunition into a target area no larger than a car. The muzzle flashes on the North Ridge disappeared instantly, replaced by small fires that marked the end of 2 Taliban fighting positions. Ghost Neptune 6, outstanding shooting. That neutralized the North Ridge threat. But we've got movement to the east now, sounds like mortars being set up. Grid coordinates 791448. Alina was already turning toward the new threat, her hands moving with practiced efficiency across controls that had become extensions of her will. The A-10 responded like a well-trained horse, banking into a shallow dive that would bring its cannon to bear on targets that represented death for 8 Americans if allowed to complete their preparations. Through her night vision system, she could see figures moving with the purposeful efficiency of experienced fighters setting up crew-served weapons. The mortar position represented a different kind of threat, indirect fire that could rain death on Martinez's team from positions they couldn't see or return fire against. Artillery was the great equalizer in mountain warfare, capable of reaching behind cover that protected against small arms fire. If those mortars became operational, the SEAL team's small depression would become a killing ground with no escape. Neptune 6, I count 4 to 6 personnel at the eastern position. Confirm no friendlies within 200 meters of that grid coordinate. Ghost confirmed. No friendlies anywhere near that position. You're cleared hot. Alina's second gun run was a masterpiece of precision flying, though descending through deteriorating weather with its cannon speaking death in 2-second bursts that erased Taliban fighters with surgical efficiency. But even as her rounds found their targets, she knew the mission was far from over. The radio crackled with Martinez's voice, and for the first time in hours she heard something approaching hope. Ghost, you magnificent bastard, that was beautiful shooting, but we've still got problems down here. The A-10 climbed back into the cloud layer, its pilot already planning the next attack run while monitoring fuel levels and ammunition counts. Alina Vasquez had built her reputation on impossible missions, but this one was testing even her considerable skills. The weather was getting worse, visibility dropping to near zero, and somewhere in the darkness below, more Taliban fighters were probably moving into position. But 8 Americans were still alive, and that meant the mission continued. Alina keyed her radio. Neptune 6, Ghost. I've got plenty of bullets left and nowhere else to be. Tell me what you need. The words carried 13 years of accumulated skill and determination, the promise of a pilot who had never left Americans behind and wasn't about to start tonight. In the mountains below, Martinez allowed himself the first smile he'd managed in 7 hours. Ghost was living up to her reputation, and that meant his team might actually see sunrise. But the night was far from over, and the Taliban weren't finished fighting. The real test of Alina Vasquez's skills was still to come, hidden in the darkness that surrounded 8 Americans and the angel of death flying invisible circles above their heads. Staff Sergeant Martinez pressed himself against the rocky outcrop and tried to count muzzle flashes in the darkness surrounding his position. The math was simple and brutal. His team had perhaps 200 rounds of small arms ammunition remaining, while Taliban forces seemed to multiply like shadows given substance. Every flash of enemy gunfire represented another angle of approach, another threat that could end American lives with a single well-placed shot. Ghost, Neptune 6, Martinez transmitted, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him. We've got movement on multiple fronts now. South and southwest, maybe 2 squads worth. They're using the terrain to get closer. I need you to keep them honest while we try to consolidate our position. 300 feet above the battlefield, Alina Vasquez banked the A-10 into another lazy circle while studying thermal imagery that painted the landscape in shades of green and white. The Taliban fighters showed up as bright spots against the cooler background, their body heat betraying positions that would have been invisible to the naked eye. She counted at least 15 distinct heat signatures, moving with the coordinated efficiency of experienced fighters who understood mountain warfare. Neptune 6, I've got eyes on multiple contacts approaching from your south. Stand by for fires. Alina's voice carried the calm confidence of someone who had turned killing into an art form, but her hands trembled slightly as she aligned the aircraft for another gun run. Not from fear. She'd left fear behind somewhere over Iraq in 2019, but from exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. This was her fourth mission in 6 days, and each one had demanded everything she had to give. The GAU-A-10 cannon spoke again, its 2-second burst sending 40 rounds of 30 ammunition into a cluster of Taliban fighters who had made the mistake of moving across open ground. The thermal imagery showed 3 heat signatures disappear instantly, while others scattered for cover that would provide only temporary protection. Alina was already selecting her next target when Martinez's voice cut through the static with new urgency. "Ghost, we've got a problem. Corporal Williams took shrapnel from something, maybe a grenade. He's bleeding pretty bad and we can't get to our medic bag. These bastards have us pinned down tight." Alina felt something cold settle in her stomach. Wounded Americans changed every calculation, added variables that transformed tactical problems into moral imperatives. Williams was somebody's son, somebody's husband or brother, and his life was now measured in minutes rather than hours. The math of survival had shifted again, and Alina was the only one who could balance the equation. Neptune 6, how mobile is Williams? Can he move under his own power? Negative, Ghost. He's conscious but losing blood fast. We need to get him stabilized and extracted, but we can't move more than a few feet without taking fire from multiple directions. Alina climbed the A-10 back into the cloud layer while processing information that would determine whether 8 Americans lived or died before sunrise. The wounded man represented a tactical complication that could cascade into catastrophe if not handled correctly. But Alina had handled catastrophes before, turned disasters into footnotes in classified reports that no one outside the intelligence community would ever read. Neptune 6, I need you to listen carefully. I'm going to make multiple passes to suppress enemy fire while you move Williams to better cover. There's a rock formation about 30 meters northeast of your current position. Thermal shows it as a cold spot, which means protection from small arms fire. Can you reach that position? Martinez studied the darkness through night vision goggles that turned the world into green-tinted shadows. The rock formation Ghost described was visible, but 30 meters might as well have been 30 miles with Taliban fighters controlling the high ground. Moving a wounded man across open terrain under fire was exactly the kind of tactical decision that got entire teams killed. But staying in place guaranteed death for Williams, and probably for the rest of them as enemy forces continued to converge on their position. Sometimes survival came down to choosing between bad options and worse ones, and Martinez had been making those choices for 12 years. Ghost, we'll make the move on your word. Just keep their heads down long enough for us to get Williams to cover. Alina's response came immediately. Neptune 6, moving into attack position now. When you hear my guns, move fast and move together. I'll stay in the pattern until you're all safe. The promise carried weight beyond its tactical implications. Alina Vasquez had never lost Americans under her protection, and she wasn't about to start with 8 SEALs who were depending on her to turn impossible odds into survival. But as she banked the A-10 into its attack heading, she knew this would be the most challenging flying of her career. The A-10 Thunderbolt II descended through cloud cover so thick it seemed solid, guided by instruments that painted electronic pictures of terrain that wanted to kill everyone brave enough or foolish enough to fight over it. Alina's hands moved across controls with muscle memory developed through thousands of hours flying over places where people shot at her professionally. But tonight felt different. Tonight carried personal weight that transformed routine close air support into something approaching art. Neptune 6, Ghost is inbound from the west. I'll make 3 passes to suppress enemy positions while you move your wounded man. First pass will target the ridge positions to your south. Second pass will hit the eastern approaches. Third pass will be danger close to provide cover during your movement. Acknowledge when you're ready to move. Martinez looked at his team, 7 faces painted with camouflage that couldn't hide exhaustion or fear. Williams lay propped against a rock, conscious but pale, blood seeping through field dressings that were already soaked through. The rock formation Ghost had identified offered better protection, but reaching it would require crossing 30 meters of ground that Taliban fighters had been watching for hours. Ghost, Neptune 6 ready to move on your command. Alina's first gun run was a masterpiece of precision, the GAU-8A cannon stitching 30 rounds across ridge positions with accuracy that eliminated 3 Taliban fighting positions in 4 seconds of sustained fire. The distinctive sound of the cannon, a deep, throaty growl that seemed to shake the mountains themselves, was followed by the silence that came when professional soldiers stopped shooting because they were no longer capable of shooting. "Move, move, move," Martinez shouted, and 7 Americans rose from cover like shadows given substance. 2 men grabbed Williams under his arms while others provided covering fire, the entire team moving with coordinated efficiency born from training that had prepared them for exactly this kind of nightmare scenario. 30 meters had never seemed so far, each step measured in heartbeats that hammered against their ribs like trapped birds. Alina's second pass caught a squad of Taliban fighters trying to flank the moving Americans. Her cannon found them in the open, scattered them like leaves before a hurricane. But even as her rounds eliminated immediate threats, her tactical display showed more heat signatures moving through terrain that provided countless concealment opportunities. The enemy had numbers and position. The Americans had training, and an A-10 pilot who had made a career out of defying conventional wisdom. Neptune 6, you've got more contacts moving in from the north. I count at least 8 personnel in 2 groups, approximately 400 meters out but closing fast. Martinez's team reached the rock formation as Alina's third pass sent rounds whistling just meters over their heads, so close they could feel the displacement of air from projectiles traveling at nearly half the speed of sound. Williams was semi-conscious but still breathing, and the new position offered significantly better protection from small arms fire. But protection was relative when Taliban forces controlled the high ground and seemed determined to prove that 8 Americans couldn't be extracted alive. "Ghost, we're in position. Williams is stable for now, but we need medical evacuation within the hour or we're going to lose him." Alina climbed back into the cloud layer, her mind already working through possibilities that grew more limited with each passing minute. Fuel was becoming an issue, ammunition was running low, and weather conditions continued to deteriorate. But 8 Americans were alive because of her intervention, and Alina Vasquez had never left anyone behind in 13 years of flying missions that others considered impossible. Neptune 6 Ghost, I'm coordinating with Overlord for medical evacuation. Stay tight, stay low, and trust me to keep the bad guys away from your position. The words carried promises that extended beyond tactical assurances. Alina was betting her reputation, her career, and possibly her life on the belief that skill and determination could overcome odds that looked increasingly impossible. But she'd made similar bets before, and so far, she'd always found a way to collect. The game was far from over, but the rules were becoming clear. 8 Americans against unknown numbers of Taliban fighters, with Alina Vasquez as the only factor standing between survival and catastrophe. In the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, legends were written in gunfire and blood, and tonight was adding another chapter to a story that would be remembered long after the shooting stopped. But first, there were more Taliban to kill, and Alina's A-10 had plenty of ammunition remaining. The math of survival was about to be recalculated with 30 arithmetic that brooked no argument and accepted no appeals. The operations center at Bagram Air Base had taken on the controlled urgency of a trauma room, voices speaking in clipped sentences that carried more weight than their brevity suggested. Captain Rodriguez monitored multiple tactical displays while coordinating assets that existed more on paper than in practical reality. The weather over eastern Afghanistan had deteriorated beyond the margins of safety, grounding most aircraft and leaving Alina Vasquez as the only friendly asset within striking distance of 8 Americans who were running out of time. "Ghost, Overlord," came Rodriguez's voice through Alina's headset. "We're working on medical evacuation, but weather is below minimums for helicopter operations. Nearest medevac bird is grounded at Fobshank, approximately 40 minutes flight time once conditions improve." Alina banked the A-10 through cloud cover that reduced visibility to near zero, while processing information that transformed Williams's survival from likely to questionable. 40 minutes was an eternity for a man losing blood in terrain, where advanced medical care meant whatever a Navy corpsman could accomplish with field supplies. But Alina had spent 13 years making impossible things possible, and tonight wouldn't be the first time she'd had to invent solutions that didn't exist in any manual. "Overlord Ghost, what about ground evacuation? Can we get vehicles to Neptune 6's position?" "Negative, Ghost. Terrain is impassable for wheeled vehicles, and the nearest passable road is 12 kilometers from their position. Even if we had assets available, movement time would be prohibitive." Alina studied her tactical display while flying lazy circles above a battlefield where mathematics had reduced human lives to probability calculations. Williams needed medical attention that couldn't reach him, extraction that wasn't available, and time that was running out with each heartbeat that pushed more blood through wounds that field dressings couldn't fully control. But the display also showed something else: heat signatures moving with the coordinated efficiency of Taliban fighters who understood that wounded Americans represented tactical opportunities. "Neptune 6, Ghost. I'm seeing increased enemy movement converging on your position. Looks like they know you've got a wounded man, and they're planning to capitalize on your reduced mobility." Martinez's voice carried exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. "Ghost, we're not going anywhere without Williams, and he's not going anywhere without a stretcher. We need time more than we need bullets right now." Time. The one resource Alina couldn't manufacture with precision flying or superior firepower. But she could buy time with well-placed 30 rounds, purchase minutes with tactical flying that kept Taliban forces at distances measured in fear rather than meters. The A-10's ammunition counter showed 200 rounds remaining, enough for perhaps 6 more gun runs if she was careful. But careful had never kept Americans alive when their survival depended on aggressive application of controlled violence. "Neptune 6, I'm going to establish a defensive perimeter around your position. Any movement within 400 meters of your coordinates is going to have a very bad day. Just keep Williams stable and let me handle the rest." Alina dropped the A-10 below the cloud deck again, flying at an altitude that would have horrified safety inspectors, but provided perfect positioning for close air support in terrain that demanded precision measured in inches. Through her targeting systems, she could see Taliban fighters moving through draws and ravines that offered concealment from ground-level observation, but couldn't hide body heat from thermal imaging equipment that turned the landscape into a chessboard where every piece was visible. Her next gun run eliminated a 4-man team that had been moving toward Martinez's position from the southwest. 30 rounds of 30 ammunition, distributed across targets that disappeared from her thermal display with mechanical finality. But even as she eliminated immediate threats, Alina could see more heat signatures moving through terrain that seemed designed for guerrilla warfare, landscape that gave every advantage to defenders who understood that patience was often more valuable than firepower. "Ghost, Neptune 6, Outstanding shooting, but we're still seeing movement from multiple directions. These guys aren't giving up. Alina wasn't surprised. Taliban fighters had been surviving in these mountains for decades, fighting Soviets and Americans with equal determination, learning lessons written in blood and carved into landscape that had swallowed armies throughout history. They understood that 8 Americans represented propaganda value that extended far beyond tactical considerations, and wounded Americans represented opportunities that patient fighters could turn into catastrophic victories. But Alina Vasquez had been turning Taliban opportunities into obituaries for 13 years, and tonight would be no exception. She keyed her radio. Neptune 6, Ghost. I've got bullets, I've got fuel, and I've got nowhere else to be. These mountains aren't big enough for Taliban fighters and my A-10. We're going to find out which one breaks first. The promise carried 13 years of accumulated skill and a grandmother's lessons about reading signs that couldn't be measured by instruments, about understanding that survival often came down to seeing what others missed. Below, 8 Americans pressed themselves against cold stone and listened to the sound of salvation circling overhead, guided by hands that had never failed when failure meant death for people who had trusted their lives to her judgment. The night was far from over, but Alina Vasquez was just getting started. And in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, that made all the difference between survival and statistics. Staff Sergeant Martinez checked his watch and tried to calculate probabilities that kept shifting toward disaster. Williams had been bleeding for 90 minutes now, despite field dressings and pressure that had slowed but not stopped the hemorrhaging. The corpsman's assessment was brutally direct. Without surgical intervention within 2 hours, Williams would go into shock and die. Time had become an enemy more dangerous than Taliban fighters, and time was winning. Ghost, Neptune 6. Williams is deteriorating. We need extraction within the hour or medical care comes to us. Current options don't include either. 300 feet above the trapped seals, Alina Vasquez wrestled with tactical problems that had no textbook solutions. The A-10's fuel gauge showed enough for perhaps 30 more minutes of flight time. Ammunition was running low, and weather conditions continued to deteriorate. But abandoning 8 Americans wasn't among the options she'd consider, which meant finding solutions that didn't exist in any manual she'd ever read. Neptune 6, Ghost. I'm going to try something unconventional. There's a small valley approximately 2 kilometers northwest of your position, wide enough for aircraft operations if the weather cooperates. Thermal imaging shows it's currently unoccupied by enemy forces. Martinez studied his tactical map through night vision goggles that turned terrain features into green-tinted possibilities. The valley Ghost described was visible on his GPS, but reaching it would require movement through territory that Taliban fighters had been infiltrating for hours. 2 kilometers might as well have been 200 with a wounded man who couldn't walk unassisted. Ghost, negative on movement to that position. Williams can't make that distance, and we'd have to cross at least 3 ridgelines that are probably occupied by hostiles. Alina had expected that response, but the valley represented possibilities that extended beyond extraction. Sometimes unconventional problems required unconventional solutions, and Alina had built her career on proving that creativity mattered more than protocol when American lives hung in the balance. She keyed her radio again. Neptune 6, I'm not talking about you moving to the valley. I'm talking about bringing medical care to you. The silence on the radio stretched for several seconds before Martinez responded. Ghost, clarify your intentions. Alina was already turning the A-10 toward Bagram Air Base, her mind racing through possibilities that would have horrified safety inspectors and delighted tacticians who understood that warfare often came down to individual decisions that couldn't be delegated or reviewed by committee. Neptune 6, maintain your position and keep Williams stable. I'm going to get creative. 20 minutes later, Alina's A-10 touched down at Bagram with the controlled urgency of someone who had already made decisions that would either save 8 lives or end her career. She taxied to the medical evacuation staging area, where a flight medic named Senior Airman Thompson was preparing equipment that might never be used if weather conditions didn't improve. "Thompson, grab your gear and get in," Alina called through the aircraft's canopy. "We're going to make a house call." Thompson looked at the A-10 with understandable confusion. The Thunderbolt II was a single-seat aircraft, designed for close air support rather than medical evacuation. Its cramped cockpit could barely accommodate a pilot, much less a pilot and a flight medic with medical equipment. But Alina had identified a solution that existed in technical specifications, but had never been attempted in combat conditions. "Ma'am, the A-10 doesn't have passenger seating." "No, but it has equipment bays that can be reconfigured for emergency purposes. Strip your gear down to absolute essentials and meet me on the flight line in 5 minutes. We're going to rewrite the book on combat medical evacuation." Alina spent those 5 minutes coordinating with maintenance personnel, who understood that creative solutions often violated regulations, but sometimes saved lives that regulations couldn't protect. The A-10's rear equipment bay was cleared of non-essential gear, and Thompson's medical supplies were secured with tie-downs that would keep them stable during flight operations that would test the limits of both aircraft and crew. "Ghost Neptune 6, came Martinez's voice as Alina prepared for takeoff. "Williams is unconscious now. We're losing him." Alina's response carried 13 years of accumulated confidence and a grandmother's lessons about seeing possibilities that others missed. "Neptune 6, Ghost is inbound with medical support. Estimate 15 minutes to your position. Keep Williams breathing and trust me to handle the rest." The A-10 lifted off into weather that had grounded every other aircraft on the base, carrying a flight medic who had volunteered for a mission that didn't exist in any manual. But Alina Vasquez had made a career out of missions that weren't supposed to be possible, and tonight would be no exception. In the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, 8 Americans waited for salvation that was approaching at 200 knots, guided by hands that had never failed when failure meant death for people who trusted their lives to her judgment. The night was about to take a turn that no one had anticipated, but Alina had stopped worrying about conventional wisdom years ago. Creative solutions required creative flying, and Alina Vasquez had always been the most creative pilot in any squadron lucky enough to have her services. The A-10 climbed through weather that reduced the world to instrument readings and faith, carrying a flight medic who was questioning his life choices while strapped into a rear equipment bay that had never been designed for human occupancy. Senior Airman Thompson pressed himself against hastily installed padding and tried to process the reality that he was flying into combat in an aircraft that officially couldn't carry passengers, guided by a pilot who had somehow convinced him that impossible missions were just regular missions that hadn't been attempted yet. "Thompson, how are you doing back there?" Alina's voice came through the intercom system that connected the cockpit to the equipment bay, a modification that maintenance personnel had accomplished in 4 minutes using parts that weren't technically approved for the purpose, but worked perfectly for the mission at hand. "Ma'am, I'm secure and my equipment is stable. This is definitely not covered in any manual I've ever read." Alina's laugh carried 13 years of accumulated confidence in solutions that worked regardless of their official status. "Thompson, manuals are written by people who have never had to save Americans in terrain that's trying to kill everyone involved. We're writing new chapters tonight." The A-10 descended through cloud cover that obscured everything beyond the cockpit, guided by GPS coordinates that represented more than tactical positions.